5 or 6 times now, and every time Google Hangouts does something different. Okay, so we are now live. We'll give people a couple of minutes to arrive in and sort of begin to click on things and so on. In the meantime, I'll do two things. Firstly is to welcome everyone who's here, particularly Eric Charles, our speaker for this month, and to the viewers as they come in. I'll give people a little reminder that the questions and answer session at the end of the seminar this month will be through two media. One is through the standard Q&A app, and if the Q&A app is not active for you, you might have a small sort of set of white boxes icon on the top right of your screen, which will allow you to basically, if you click on that icon, you may be able to activate the Q&A app, and that will allow you to write questions, which will become available. And the second medium is through the Hangouts on Air system itself, where a few people can actually sort of join in as speaking participants this month for the first time that we're going to get to try this. So if you look at the event page for the talk, there is a link in the first comments, in the first couple of comments there, which will act as an invitation. And if you click on that link, it should allow you to just join as a speaking member. So although because this is the first time we've done this, I am reserving the right to use the ban hammer and mute button freely in order to control things if things get out of hand. But a little bit of free-flowing discussion would actually be quite nice. So we have, I think we'll sort of get started, and then people can come in as they arrive. I think we'll gradually. Things tend to build up over the first few minutes. So it's a particular pleasure actually to welcome Eric Charles to give our I think our sixth ENSO seminar, and we're continuing our tradition of jumping continent with each time. We were in Europe in February, and we're back to North America now, to Washington DC, where Eric will be presenting from the American University. Eric is a graduate of the University of California, Davis, where he did master's and PhD. And went on to Clark University and spent some time at Pennsylvania State. And you're now at the American University in Washington. So he's published a good many papers in the area, principally in the sort of history and theory of psychology. I'll include. I'm gonna plug the book because I really like the book. And this is an edited text by Eric, which includes, I think, some of the kinds of themes that he'll be talking about today. It's a new look at the new realism, which is an exploration of some of the issues and ideas raised by Edwin Holt's work in the early decades of the 20th century. And Eric, I'm also looking forward to Eric's talk because Eric, I have personally indicated I think there's a strong relationship between ecological psychology and activism. I'm not the only one to have said that. I'm just sort of joining that particular bandwagon. But Eric is the first speaker in the ENSO seminars who might consider an ecological psychologist in the clearest terms. So we have a few viewers now, and we might, again, continue to pick some up as we continue on. But I think at this point, I shall hand over to you, Eric, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. For a little bit more about me, I would actually characterize myself more as a general experimental psychologist. So my early background was in animal behavior, comparative psychology, ethology. My PhD was in developmental psychology. I've studied parent-infant interaction. And as I've moved from place to place, the labs you can set up are different. So I've also done studies about social behavior, borderline sociological issues, video games and violent behavior, all sorts of different topics like that. And I sort of backdoored into history and theory of psychology. That wasn't originally my area. But as I became interested in ecological psychology and I saw these similarities between my different interests, I sort of kept going back in time and back in time and back in time. And so part of what's going to happen here is that I'm going to tell the story of what the field looks like for me going forward in time. So let me start the slides here. I am nothing if not ambitious in my selection of titles. And so this talk is going to be kind of fast-moving and give a very large picture here about the philosophical foundations of embodied cognition, and it's going to eventually start 140 years ago. So you might have noticed in the title that I said the groundwork of our field, because I wanted to be inclusive. And what do I mean by our field? I mean a pretty wide range of things. Embodied cognition and activism, perceptual control theory, developmental psychobiology, ecological psychology. There's actually a very cool strain of psychological realism down in Australia that's tightly connected with all of this work. Some work in evolutionary psychology. I'm particularly thinking of people like Barrett. Molar behaviorism. There's actually a lot of things that would be similar here with some approaches to phenomenology and folk psychology. People like Joel Kruger and Dan Hutto. Descriptive mentalism, and also the new unified psychology that Greg Henriquez has been working on for a while. So this is a pretty, I'm going to try to get pretty broad and inclusive here by the end. Now, unfortunately, I do have to give one caveat, and that is that when I'm talking about our field, I'm mostly going to say the word behaviorism. And I apologize. I know for some people, behaviorists are still the bogeyman hiding in the closet, waiting to jump out at psychology at any moment. But using that simple term makes it a lot easier, and as you'll see eventually, I think it's historically important. What I'm going to do is go through the old story of behaviorism. I'm going to offer a new story. I'm going to talk about what behaviorism is in that new story. I'm going to talk about where that leads us into the present, the current fields that are working on this. And then I'm going to talk about two broad problems that I think are solved by this improved story that I'm going to tell. So we all know the old introductory psychology story of behaviorism. Once upon a time, there was this man named John Watson. He came out of nowhere. He shocked the field and blew everybody's mind. He stopped the dominant, evil work of those introspectionists. He totally denied the existence of the mind. His work was closely related to logical positivism in the Vienna Circle, and he began the study of operant conditioning and behavior analysis. You might realize that this is kind of an odd story. In fact, the introspective method, at least the one Watson was attacking, was never that dominant. Watson, in fact, didn't outright reject the mind. Logical positivism hadn't happened yet. Operant conditioning hadn't happened yet. In fact, if you go back to Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, Watson's justifications for his approach are almost entirely personal. What he continuously complains that him and his friends aren't invited to the nice conferences, and that nobody really knows what to do with them. And he's basically throwing down his hammer and saying, if you don't play nice with us, we're going to go play with someone else. That's really the strongest argument he has. Also, his ideas are not that novel. People have been offering automaton theories of human behavior every couple of hundred years for millennia. And Watson wasn't really that charismatic. More importantly, maybe, there was in fact no core idea that Watson was representing. Even by the 1920s, it was hard to determine what the core of behaviorism was because there were all these warring schools. And each of the warring schools had declared that their idiosyncratic approach was what real behaviorism was. And eventually, this all washes out in our standard intro psych textbook into a really odd entailment of behaviorism and learning theory, which have only a historic connection. I mean, if we suddenly proved that everything that Pavlov had thought was wrong, or that it only applied to dogs and drool, that would in no way undo behaviorism. but in fact, that's how it's presented in an intro textbook. Another thing to note is that Watson was inspired by Jacques Loeb, who was his primary advisor at the University of Chicago. And Wozniak tells us, noting that any attempt to decide whether animals have intelligence necessarily plunges the biologist into a sterile discussion of the meaning of the term intelligence, Loeb made a startling assertion. The aim of modern biology, he wrote, is no longer word discussion, but the control of life phenomenon. Not only was Loeb's science to be oriented towards identifying the objective signs of psychical process and describing the objective conditions that determine the animal's reactions, it was to be a science whose theoretical goal was the control of learning and behavior. So Watson's approach is coming out of this view of biology. It's not coming out of a psychological historic context at all. And I do want to emphasize that what Watson was saying was not that novel. So Watson's work really offers two relatively weak challenges to mainstream psychology. It offers methodological behaviorism, which is when you say, well, mental stuff exists, but we really can't study it, so let's just, all agree to study behavior instead. Which is a perfectly reasonable position for people who want to be contributing members to their field, but it's still dualistic, and it doesn't challenge anything about how a philosopher might think about psychological processes. Watson is often taken, which he did a little bit later in his life, to have been promoting eliminative behaviorism, which is where you deny that psychical processes exist at all. And as I mentioned, there's a long line of people for hundreds of years saying this, nothing new. Watson's notion that we're explaining muscle twitches is utterly uncompelling when you're trying to explain macromolar behaviors. And it denies the phenomenon of interest, which is a really bad way to go if you want to pretend to be a psychologist. So I think the big question, which is completely missed by this early story, this traditional story, is why anyone would care in the slightest about what Watson had to say. It's personal, it's not that new. Why did anyone care? And I think we can explain that by offering an alternative story of behaviorism. And what I want this story to do is to explain how the aesthetic of an entire generation of psychologists was somehow prepared for this thing that Watson came in and said. Right? There was an entire generation of psychologists who bought this line and flocked to it rapidly. Why did that happen? And what's the core idea that made this appealing? So, the attempt at least, a better history. This story is going to begin with a completely different person, Charles Sanders Peirce. And Peirce was an extreme, eccentric expert in just about anything he tried. He was famous for his contributions to mathematics, statistics, geography, experimental psychology, widely regarded as the best logician of his time, best semiotician of his time, a little bit of everything. He's a very popular candidate for the most neglected American genius in history. If you're into science fiction and engineering, then Tesla is the obvious choice. If it's not Tesla, it's probably this guy. He founded the field known as Pragmatism, and interestingly enough, is hardly remembered at all in the United States. In fact, it's much easier for me to have a conversation about Peirce when I travel to conferences in any part of Europe, any part of South America, than it is to have a conversation about him in America, in the US. Our story begins in 1877 with a paper called The Fixation of Belief. And in that paper, Peirce declares that belief and habit are the same thing. He derives this using the yet-to-be-explained pragmatic method. The pragmatic method is that if you think about all the possible consequences that a thing might have, that's what the thing is. And in this paper, he runs head-on into Descartes, where Descartes claims to doubt things and seems to think that doubt is a purely intellectual exercise. And Peirce says, well, what are the possible consequences of doubt? Doubt is an uncertainty in action. What's the opposite of doubt? The opposite of doubt is belief. And belief, therefore, is certainty in action. So the only consequence that, quote unquote, having a belief has is the establishment of a habit, a pattern of action one is inclined to do regularly. And he further states in that paper that the feeling of believing is a more or less sure indication of there being established in our nature some habit which will determine our actions. So to feel like you believe something is to feel like you have a reliable habit. He elaborates on this a bit in 1878 in How to Make Our Ideas Clear. The essence of belief is the establishment of habit, and different beliefs are distinguished by the different modes of action to which they give rise. The identity of a habit depends on how it might lead us to act, not merely under such circumstances as are likely to arise, but under such as might possibly occur, no matter how improbable they might be. And he's very clear to say that if you're interested in determining the meaning of a belief, there's nothing to do, no fine distinction to be made that isn't ultimately a difference in practice, a difference in what somebody would do in one situation or another. So belief and habit are isomorphic. They're the same thing. Now, is that exactly what Peirce meant? Who knows? Peirce was widely misunderstood. He emphasized that himself repeatedly. In addition to a cadre of modern pragmatists, philosophers, there's a whole field specifically of Peirce studies where people argue about what exactly Peirce meant by any of his things. I do know, however, I'm confident in saying that many people understood that to be what Peirce meant, because Peirce had some friends. Peirce developed a lot of these ideas in the Metaphysical Club at Harvard that included such people as Oliver Wendell Holmes, Chauncey Wright, and this swag gentleman over here named William James. James at the time is studying to be a medical doctor. He's shortly to become an instructor of anatomy and physiology at Harvard. And he's keen to note that he, in fact, had no formal training in philosophy or psychology. He'd never had any formal philosophical instruction, and the first lecture on psychology he ever heard was the first he gave. So James is heavily influenced by Peirce's thinking. Whether or not he misunderstood him, we'll leave that aside. James's main influence on the field are his two textbooks, Principles of Psychology and Psychology, a Briefer Course. They're sort of the iconic James. And both books lack a proper foundation. And I'm pretty safe saying that because James's writings of the time continuously lament his inability to slow down and put a proper foundation underneath the field he's trying to create here. And so the book is dualistic in some sense, but it's also riddled with bits of realism, pragmatism, some explicitly anti-dualist bits, and what I would call a proto-behaviorism. Some example quotes out of Briefer Course. Mental facts cannot be properly studied apart from the physical environment of which they take cognizance. The essence of mental life and bodily life are one, namely, the adjustment of inner to outer relations. States of mind as such, all states of mind, even mere thoughts and feelings, are motor in their consequences. Let it be set down as one of the fundamental facts of the science. The emotion here is nothing but the feeling of a bodily state, and it has a purely bodily cause. Everyone assumes that we have direct introspective acquaintance, but I am suspicious. Whenever I try to become sensible of my thinking activities as such, what I catch is some bodily fact. And yes, this is sort of a foundationless setup. So James has raised, at this point, by 1910, 1913, 20 years worth of psychologists have been weaned on William James. All of this stuff is implicit in all of his writing. The monism, the pragmatism, the idea of body and mind is one thing. And Watson just stumbles into the middle of this multi-decade setup. He's the only major psychologist of the time who was not weaned on William James. He was brought up on Loeb. He's widely considered to be philosophy inept. He's a salesman. He's very good at it. But he's not a deep philosophical thinker. And he derailed this whole shebang that was about to happen. What it was headed towards, what came later, was James's radical empiricism. This came after his mainstream psychology phase. It came after his pragmatism phase. And it was what he thought was the long-promised foundation for psychology. One way to explain what it is, there are many ways, there's also a whole field of William James studies, is that it's what James thought was the necessary foundation for a science of psychology. I don't want to go too deep into radical empiricism, but I do want to hum a few bars of it. The entity, consciousness, is fictitious, while thoughts in the concrete are fully real. But thoughts in the concrete are made of the same stuff as things are. Consciousness connotes a kind of external relation and does not denote a special stuff or way of being. Knowing, therefore, or the conscious relation of the object to the self, is thus only an incident of the wider process of adjustment, which includes unconscious adjustment as well. And this last part is a quote from a questionnaire that he was mailed asking about his beliefs in psychical phenomenon. And his response to the questionnaire is held at the Harvard Archives. And one of the questions was, do you accept the spiritual testimony of others? And James writes down, yes, the whole line of testimony on this point is so strong. No doubt there is a germ in me of something similar that makes response. And of course, James's interest in psychical phenomenon is its own little thing. But what's interesting is that James was particularly good at living his way of thinking. And in this case, even when asked about his own beliefs, he replies, well, something in me is responding to it. I have some habit that seems to imply that it's true, so clearly I must believe that it's true. So his answer encapsulates this way of thinking that belief is a doing something. For another interlude, I want to look back quickly at the James Lange theory of emotion. The modern intro psych textbook version is that this was somehow a debate about the order of action and emotion, which one came first. That's a complete misunderstanding of what James was trying to do. James was giving an alternative, descriptive, and definitional idea of what emotion was. For James, the behavior in context was doing the emotion. Running from the bear was doing bear fear. And while one was doing bear fear, one might reflectively perceive that and thereby feel afraid. So it's not an order issue. The running from the bear is the fear. And then separately, one can respond to what one is doing and thereby feel afraid. In the same way, somebody else observing you run from the bear could see your fear, because it's an external relation out there in the world. These are some more quotes talking about emotion and radical empiricism, and similar to what I was saying before, talking about the emotion as out there in the world. So the dangerousness, beauty, rarity, utility are aspects out there in the world that appeal to our attention. And if you look down in the second quote, the disgustingness of a massive carrion fails to operate within the realm of suns and breezes, but the disgustingness has a direct operation. It functions physically in the limited part of physics that includes our body. So whatever disgustingness is, it's out there in the world. And sometimes we're responding to it, and sometimes we're not. Is this really behaviorism? Well, at the least, it's heading there. And few people appreciated this connection. One big exception is a guy named Holt. And I've listed a handful of people here who have written about Holt and his connection to these ideas. Edwin Bissell Holt went from a student to an assistant professor at Harvard. He was teaching there from 1900 to 1918, and was, in principle, the de facto head of human research at Harvard for most of the 18 years he taught there. Munsterberg was the ostensible head of the lab, but he was off traveling and lecturing most of the time, and Robert Yerkes stayed there and took care of almost all of the animal research, and Holt oversaw almost all of the human research. So by today's publishing standards, that would have made him a co-author on hundreds and hundreds of the most important papers that came out of Harvard over that time period. But by the publishing standards of the time, he was rarely even acknowledged. He was a member of a couple of groups, including the Witch Club, the New Realists, and Titchener's Experimentalists. He left Harvard in a huff in 1918, and they even tried to counter his leaving with an offer of a professorship and chair of the department, but he was resigned to resign. His friend Langfeld wooed him out to Princeton for about a decade, and he had a strong influence on many of his colleagues, many of his students. At Harvard, people like Tolman and Floyd Allport. At Princeton, people like James Gibson, as well as many other contemporaries at the time. So Joseph Jastrow even writes that he's part of what he's fighting for is to see clinical psychology turn back towards Holt's vision of how Freud would work, for example. And Gibson tells us later on that Holt had known William James but approved only of the tough-minded work, which is probably a good way of phrasing it. Holt's major books included The New Realism, The Concept of Consciousness, The Freudian Wish and Its Place in Ethics, and Animal Drives in the Learning Process, an essay towards radical empiricism. Animal Drives, incidentally, was a part one explicitly. It deals almost entirely with physiology, and the part two never quite happened. Also of note, which I've written about elsewhere, is that Holt had actually been contracted by the James family and spent almost a decade trying to create a revision of Psychology, a Briefer Course. But it never quite happened, and that's a talk for another time. Concept of Consciousness is a book dedicated almost entirely to hammering people with the notion that there's no magic in the brain, only physiology. Whenever somebody tries to say there's an image in the brain, a memory in the brain, anything like that, no. What's in the brain are cells. And it's a perfectly good area of study, just like studying a stomach. In The Freudian Wish, Holt interprets Freud into a behaviorist sort of form and claims that Holt's main insight is that the wish is a bodily orientation towards a goal, and that everything interesting about Freudian psychology plays out when one has two bodily orientations that cannot manifest at the same time. Actually, though, that's mostly just the first chapter. After that, in The Freudian Wish, he goes down into the levels of anatomy, more microscopic than Freud ever did, and builds up to this notion, this behaviorist notion, starting with simple animals with only 2 or 3 neurons, and goes up to complex human action. And then in the chapter after that, he expands out even wider and talks about the implications of this way of thinking for ethics in a very, very grand sort of statement. Throughout it is the argument that the mind is visible in behavior. So he has a number of episodes where he talks about the types of insights we might be looking for when we asked somebody what they were thinking, for example, and pointed out that to the extent that we can even trust their self-reports, we could probably have found all of that out by simply observing what they do in various situations. That the best self-report can possibly show you is what you could have observed under the right conditions anyway. He also has an important section where he rejects what he calls the bead theory of psychology. And this is the notion that one can explain things by a series of states that the organism moves through. For example, we wouldn't explain these days water falling down a waterfall by saying it was at this height, then it was at this height, then it was at this height, then it was at this height. That doesn't explain the falling at all. The pull of water towards the center of the earth is what explains the falling water. And he believes that we make a similar mistake, for example, when we look to explain psychological processes with reference to physiology. For example, reference to the brain. So if I try to explain how I see and pick up the cup in front of me, to say, well, my body is in a state where these neurons are firing, and that explains how my body is in a state where these next neurons are firing, and that explains how my body is in a state when these next neurons are firing. In fact, all of that stuff is true, but it's not really an explanation at all. Right? In fact, it's just restating in a finer grained analysis the thing to be explained. He argues that behavior is directed, and that a proper description of behavior includes the aspects of the world towards which the behavior is directed. Or depending on which thing you're reading, he wants to know what aspect of the world the behavior is a function of. Again, similar to what the water is doing in the waterfall is falling towards the center of the earth. If you could move the center of the earth, the water would fall differently. So true for behavior, what aspect of the world has that behavior become a function of? The two central metaphors for Holt are the metaphor of a cross-section. So for example, if you cut a tree, in one direction you can see rings. If you cut it at another angle, you can see ovals. If you cut it at another angle, you see almost straight parallel lines. And the idea is that consciousness similarly cuts a cross-section of the world. He also offers the searchlight metaphor for consciousness, which is that consciousness is like a searchlight illuminating a cliff face. Nobody would make the mistake of saying that the part of the cliff face that the light is shining on is composed of light stuff. And similarly, when my consciousness engulfs this cup in front of me, it would be silly to say that the cup is therefore made up of mind stuff. These are both selective metaphors. They're not constructive metaphors. They're also clearly realist metaphors, not dualistic or idealist. And interestingly, you would see references if you were looking through the works of popular psychologists, or if, like me, you took the amazingly long time of flipping through all of the history of psychology and autobiography relevant to these dates. You would see people even into the early 50s referencing the Holt searchlight metaphor of consciousness and how it was the thing that needed to be figured out. And then he disappears almost in a blink. So what Holt's working on here is a science of studying people's relations to the world. The question is, what is a person responding to, and what does that response look like? It's explanatorily neutral. It's a descriptive argument, right? The argument is that, yeah, I'll get to it. It's process-oriented, it's dynamic, it's relational, it's contextual, it's naturalistic, it's molar, and it's all about systems-level thinking. But alas, it was probably a bit ahead of its time. So to regroup, I've outlined the traditional story of behaviorism and offered a new story. The Watson-centered version, the behaviorist offers weak challenges to mainstream psychology. At best, they're reductionists in a long Western tradition. This line of thinking that goes from Peirce to James to Holt is something else entirely. I think this line of thinking from Peirce to James to Holt is what made a generation of psychologists ready to jump on this behaviorist bandwagon. So what is a behaviorist in this new story? The behaviorist in this new story offers a strong challenge to traditional psychology. It's a simple assertion. The assertion is that all questions about psychology are, when properly understood, questions about behavior. They're questions about why certain behaviors occurred under certain circumstances. This is not eliminative. All questions. I'm not trying to narrow the number of questions we can ask. I'm not trying to deny phenomena that we're interested in. I'm talking about how we invest, I'm talking about the nature of what those phenomena are. It's also not methodological. It's a deep assertion. So what does this look like in practice? I don't have a full answer. All of the work obviously hasn't been done. But I can give some hints by highlighting some approaches that seem to be working within this tradition. On the side of perception, one obvious connection to Holt in the modern day is ecological psychology, particularly as understood by James J. Gibson, but you can also connect it with the work of Roger Barker if you wanted to. Gibson's work is best understood, I assert, as a narrow and more tractable version of Holt's grand program. The central question is, how do organisms behave accurately with respect to the objects and events of the world? And the answer that Gibson offers is that perceptual systems, that perceptual systems have evolved and developed to discriminate patterns of energy that reliably guide action. This approach is called ecological because central to it is the postulate that we can analyze ambient energy patterns around us, that this ambient energy is a tractable aspect of the environment that we could study. These patterns extend over space and they extend over time, and they're out there in the world. This is Jimmy and Eleanor. These are some of their illustrations. The visual cliff with Eleanor there is probably the most famous thing to come out of ecological psychology. But if you look at Jimmy's work, you see a lot of images like this. So what's happening here is that he's showing a person moving in the room. And what's important is that these lines are not coming out of the person's eyes, right? I mean, this one's in the back of his head. The point is that the room is filled with light in different patterns. And as one moves through the room, the patterns that one is exposed to change. And that those patterns in ambient light can specify the properties of the environment around you. The way the light around this bulb, the light coming from around the bulb changes as you move through the room, can specify that this bulb is round, whereas this is a corner. And so what you do is you attune to those patterns. The perceptual system for an ecological psychologist is as much of the organism as you use to facilitate perception, the whole eye, head, neck, body, neuromuscular system. And what Gibson does typically talk about vision and eyes. The same principles apply to any modality, and there is work in ecological psychology on other modalities. The organism has been attuned to what are called higher order patterns in ambient energy, which are sometimes called invariants. And you can think of this in sort of calculus terms, that if you have an acceleration curve on a graph, You can take a derivative and create a flattened line, perhaps. So those higher order patterns that are present out there in the world. In particular, Gibson asserts that organisms are attuned to those patterns relevant to their lives, patterns that indicate opportunities for action. The reliable patterns, Gibson uses the term information. That causes a lot of confusion, but it's a good term. And the opportunities for action are called affordances. So if you hear an ecological psychologist talk about how perception is first and foremost the perception of affordances, when you unpack what that means, it means that organisms are attuned to patterns of energy in the environment that reliably indicate opportunities for action. That you can see a meaningful aspect of the world with your perceptual system. So in practice, ecological psychologists try to identify these higher order variants, demonstrate that organisms are sensitive to them, and show that the way organisms are sensitive can reliably result in correct behavior. Lots of experiments in lots of different ways. I want to talk a little bit about remembering within this approach, highlighting the work of Francois Tonneau. And he talks about memory as responding to something in a temporal distance. He actually has a very nice chapter in that book that was held up earlier. And he argues that once upon a time we thought that responding to something distant from us physically was somehow mysterious, and that we've gotten over that. But we still think it's mysterious that somebody can be responding to something that's temporally distant. And this is my metaphor, not his. But you might, for example, ask, at the dinner table, my child is really good at telling me what happened in school each day. How does he remember what happened earlier in the day? And the assertion within this way of thinking would be that your question can be answered completely by explaining how your child's behavior became a function of things that happened in the past. In particular, it sounds like the person asking this is interested in how verbal behavior comes to be a function of what happened earlier in the day. So the idea, again, is that when you properly understand a question being asked about psychology, you find that underneath that is a question about behavior. You can find glimmers of this in social psychology. Floyd Allport's very influential social psych textbook, James Gibson tells us, is stolen entirely from Holt's unpublished lecture notes. So in fact, Holt taught the first social psychology class at Harvard, and then Floyd Allport took it over after Holt left. There's also some writing that's been done recently on ecological and social psychology. These two are quotes from Ecological Psychology and Social Psychology Continuing Dialogues. And it's been argued that if ecological psychology is to make such a contribution, an important contribution to social psychology, it must be the case that A, there is something unique about social situations, and B, whatever is unique about social situations must be perceivable. So it doesn't make sense to have a realist approach to social psychology if you also postulate that what's happening in the social world isn't something that people could, in principle, respond to. And a summary of the Holt/Gibson position presented in that paper would be something like this. Organisms' perceptual systems are capable of resonating with information and ambient energy that specifies the behavioral orientation of their social partners, and that specify the larger patterns of behavior into which particular partner behaviors fit. An even simpler way of summarizing the merged position would be, we can directly perceive others' minds. See also Purposive Behaviorism by Early Tolman, which was also cribbed entirely from Holt, with the idea that the psychologist, that purpose could be studied in the laboratory because we can create it and observe it and know when we see it. One of the examples that I like to use, I take out of Aikido. And in Aikido, one has the intention of blending with their opponent's energy. And this is an example of a sequence of such moves where our guy in white here is punching forward, and the guy with the black hakama on turns and blends his force with the opponent's force. And that blending gets the guy in white to move further in the direction that he wanted to. His direction isn't being changed, it's being blended with and accelerated. And one of the interesting things that's key in an Eastern philosophy approach towards a martial art like this is that there's no sense in which the intention to blend with your opponent is this mental thing that then manifests physically. The intention to blend is nothing other than blending in the appropriate instance. So when you observe somebody practicing this and they're not very good at it, you can see that their intention is not fully developed, that they're not really committed to it. And this approach also connects closely with a lot of good work done in psychology in perceptual control theory. Particularly, I'm thinking of people like Markin and Mansell, who have written books about how when you observe how people regulate their behavior relative to the objects and events around them, you are in essence reading their minds, because their minds are manifest in that relationship. I also want to talk a little bit about embodied cognition. I'm here crimping from Andrew Wilson and Sabrina Kolonka's excellent blog. They have several papers on this. I'm sure they would have preferred I grabbed from their papers, but also almost anything by Tony Camaro. And the weak form of embodied cognition, which is becoming very popular right now, is to try to figure out if you can get the body to do something cute when you have people do mental tasks, or have cognitive states do something cute when you manipulate the body. And the hypothesis here is that the contents of our mental representations can be affected by states of the body. And ultimately, it's a very dualistic point of view. A good example of this would be a study that had people stand on a balance box and imagine larger or smaller numbers, and it was claimed that people lean to the right when thinking of small numbers and lean to the left when thinking of large numbers, and that this is because we all have a mental number line. And in our mental number line, small numbers are on one side and big numbers are on the other side. Apparently, the authors of that study are unaware that other languages often write in different directions, or potentially up and down, right to left to right, that some languages people have numbers in and you don't write them down at all because there's no written form of the language. The point is, we got somebody to do something cute on a Wii balance board. The hard form of the embodied cognition is to assert that cognitive tasks are, in fact, the body doing something, and that the type of perception and action system we have radically alters what cognition looks like. And Wilson and Kolonka say that all embodied cognitive scientists claim that the type of bodies we have affect what the final form of cognition will be, but only the second group is taking the implications seriously. And so good examples of this are figuring out what one would need to do to catch a fly ball based on the type of body somebody has and the type of information available to them. It turns out, for example, that you would think if you saw somebody hit a ball that you'd have to suddenly do a bunch of mental calculations, understand how parabolas work, insert a bit of calculus, and figure out exactly where to run to catch it. It turns out, in fact, that you can just sort of walk forward and backward and adjust the optical information you're getting off of the ball and end up very easily where you want to catch it. I can elaborate on that. I also want to talk.
Probably finish up fairly soon, Eric, if I can. So if we maybe
Yep,
just so we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
no problem. I want to talk a little bit about enactivism in cognition. I grabbed some of these quotes from some guy named McGann. Um, I'm not too familiar with his work, but I hear it's okay. Um, and I picked these quotes in particular because they very easily could have been written by Gibson or a follower of ecological psychology. They very easily could have been written by somebody in the embodied cognition tradition or perceptual control theory. Enactivism offers a theory of the mind that grounds central concepts in the autonomous organization of living organisms and in their value-laden, meaningful engagement with the environment. Psychological activity, cognition generally considered, occurs as an agent copes with or makes sense of its environment. Such coping is not generic. Actions are specific to a given situation. And the broad research question at the bottom there is how agents and their environment are coupled and what affects the coupling. So to regroup again and finish up, I've given a traditional story. I've offered a new story. I've offered a stronger definition of behaviorism and shown some of the places this plays out in practice. But perhaps people are wondering why anyone should care. I'm going to give two reasons. The first is that playing the traditional philosophical game is kind of getting old. So when I've read the works of a lot of these different approaches and taken part of some of this in the context of ecological psychology, there's a continuous struggle to figure out how to elbow out some space to breathe within the context of traditional approaches, continental approaches you might call them, to how the mind is and what it works. And I think that a lot of these awkward discussions would go a lot easier if these approaches were reframed in an American philosophical framework that automatically made sense of a lot of this and allowed you to blunt force reject a lot of the assumptions that your opponents are trying to challenge you with. And the second reason is that there are many disparate groups working towards similar shared ends, and that this provides a bit of a context to help bring those together. A number of the quotes that I used came out of a special issue of the Review of General Psychology about unifying approaches to psychology. It's a volume that I put together. It has contributions from close to 20 different approaches to psychology and shows an extreme amount of overlap between them. And one of the important points is that taken together, all of these different groups create a very large critical mass of researchers with common interests that could be a very powerful force in the field of psychology.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you, Eric. So we have a few minutes for questions now. So those of you who are interacting through the Q&A app, you should be able to activate the Q&A app through, if it's not already active, there's a small set of little icon of four white boxes in the top right, I think, of the view window. And if you click on that, then you should be able to activate your actually the Q&A app. It should be allow you to activate that where you can write in questions. And we also have only one person has taken up the direct invitation link thus far, and that's Fred Cummins at UCD. So I certainly have a few questions for you, Eric.
Sure.
And I suspect Fred will have one or two as well. So I should probably let Fred go first.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, Eric, thank you very much for what was a very exciting and wide-ranging talk. You covered an awful lot of things. I've been telling my students in the context of teaching them a little bit about Gibson not to be afraid of the behaviorist label as a slur. But after hearing you talk, I'm almost backtracking on that. When you got to verbal behavior being a function of the past, I was terrifically worried. So I felt that there were very many problems with the new accounts that you provided. I saw the naturalization, the idea, this Anglo-American insistence that the goings-on of animate beings can be captured through natural law in the same way as the goings-on of the inanimate is a severe problem, and it's also not at all in the pragmatic spirit of Peirce and James. Gibson himself is torn here. On the one hand, you've got the ecological laws and the search for optic invariance. On the other, he wants to extend his idea of affordances all the way out to a mailbox affording posting a letter, and that ain't gonna work on the basis of natural laws if it was a physical thing. So naturalism is inappropriate. In fact, I see this as one of the biggest problems. I loathe any kind of naturalism in psychology, but there was another one you threw in there, which is just as big a burden, which is individualism. And when you came to putting ecological psychology together with social psychology, I thought the world was going to implode. That's a disastrous marriage of the worst aspects of individualism and naturalism in psychology. I also felt disrespect to Skinner, who of course was well aware of the extremely important role of behavior being directed towards the world. Behaviors are not natural kinds. They don't exist. And if you want to get one thing from the enactive tradition, it's the role of the observer, that in describing a behavior, you become implicated. You can't treat it like the motion of the stars. So I'll shut up there.
So just for the last part of that, I'll see if I can work my way backwards. So in ecological psychology, like I said, many of the quotes that I read from Enactivism could easily have been written by Gibson. One of Gibson's main points about perception not being directional is that it's an interactive cyclic process, that you interact with the world, that the world interacts with you, and that it cycles. So I don't think there's any disagreement with Gibson there. Before that, you mentioned Skinner. Skinner was also influenced by some of Holt's writing, and I think some of Skinner's work fits very well within the tradition, some of it not quite as much. That's a much longer discussion.
Okay.
Let's see if I can step all the way. So,
nationalism and individualism.
For ecological psychology and social psychology, I've written a couple of papers about that. I've gotten hammered by a couple of other people in the ecological tradition that they don't like where I'm headed with it. My argument would be, that I laid out in the last paper at least, would be ecological psychology is just fine without social. Social psychology is just fine without ecological. Obviously, many aspects of how people interact with each other can be described in very traditional terms of perception-action linkages, people synchronizing their steps as they walk, things like that. But that the interesting question is whether or not ecological psychology can give insights into more uniquely social types of things. And my argument would be that if such a contribution is possible, it has to be in the direction that I laid out. And it might be that the direction that I laid out doesn't work. But if that's true, it means that ecological and social psychology have to go about their merry ways separate. Because unless there's something about, when you talk about social situations, unless something about that is perceivable in the Gibsonian sense of structuring ambient energy in a way that tells you about the affordances of the situation, then there's nothing for ecological psychologists to investigate in that context.
Aren't there two ways of looking at this? One is you can have all the goals of psychology, which is basically to explain God, the world, and everything, and say, okay, we're Gibsonians, so we're going to look for all that in the optic array. You're not going to find it. There's lots you're not going to find in the optic array. Or you can say, look, Gibson gave us something very, very beautiful. He pointed us towards the optic array and its relation to the subject, the organism-environment relation. Let's see what we can explain with that. And that's just not going to satisfy all the goals of psychology. It's not going to give you other minds. It's not going to give you lots of stuff.
Yeah, so it might be that nothing special about the ecological approach can really be applied in the social psychology situation. It might be that it's just this beautiful thing that stays over here, and other beautiful things stay over there.
That would be totally in the spirit of pragmatism, right? That's what pragmatic explanation is all about.
Yeah, so my argument isn't necessarily that it has to be that way, but that if there is overlap in the Venn diagram, this is what the overlap would have to look like. Okay. Is that sort of backing off enough to be kind of okay?
I'd actually like to throw...
I also, by the way, happen to think it's correct, but it might not be, and I'm okay with that.
Direct perception of other people's minds is Sounds like staring into people's souls. I don't buy it. But anyway, Marek, go on. You take
Well,
over.
I have a couple of questions of my own, but I would actually like to throw in just on this issue, not because I think I have any kind of insight. I'm actually just curious as to what I have a question to which I have no clue what the answer is. And insofar as, for example, so Fred talked about there's an awful lot of personal things that aren't present in the optic array, and I think the sort of issues about animacy and agency and so on that just don't seem to be there in the structure of ambient energy or chemicals. And what I'm curious about is to whether or not part of that has to do with the temporal slice of the array that we tend to work with, and that ecological psychologists tend to work with, which tends to be incredibly narrow, right? It's the duration of a fly ball is about as extensive as it gets, or a diving gannet. Whereas, for example, if I've actually written on this somewhat myself, partly in ignorance of your own work, Eric. So you have precedence here. My apologies. But I basically, if I catch the glint in my wife's eye, there is something immediate in the optical ambient energy. Just purely. I'm not talking animal energy at this stage. Just I'm still talking rays of light. But the particular structure in those rays of light are dependent on a long history of structures, which might all be physical, but we're talking, or might all be you might be able to give it a physical description, but it would take a very long time to do so, and that there is because, and in fact this is getting to Holt and the issue of we're always responding to an entire situation, not to a stimulus, not to an isolatable individual.
And that's one of Harry Half's big points.
Sorry, say that again?
I said that's one of Harry Half's big points, that there's a context responding to a whole context, a whole situation.
And it very much heft I'm drawing from on that. So I guess I'm wondering is that the way that you can look to get ecological psychology and social psychology together? Or when you start to look at things over those kinds of timescales, are some of the principles of ecological psychology effectively going to fall apart or just become unworkable?
So as I mentioned in my talk, and definitely not everyone would agree with me at this view. When I look at Gibson's work, I see him as cutting off a much narrower, more solvable, potentially, in the time he was working, chunk of Holt's work. So the metaphors are almost exactly the same. The question is, what are you responding to? What is the response? What aspect of the world? Trying to define the aspect of the world. But I think what Gibson would call the perception-action context is a much more narrow slice of the much broader thing that Holt was looking at. And that Holt would absolutely get at what you're saying. So one of the interesting sections of Holt, he talks about the man walking past his window, and he says, what is the man doing? He's walking past the window. No, he's walking to the street corner. No, he's walking to the theater. No, he's a critic, and it's actually his actual directedness is towards the critique of the play that he's going to write later that night. And so what happens is that you have to expand out the swath of the world that you're looking at until you get the part of the world of which behavior is a function. So in Roger Barker's work that Heft likes to talk about, the thing you're responding to might be that you're in line at a hot dog stand or that you're in church. For those who don't know, Barker did these amazing studies where he put an entire city under a microscope. He had a team of research psychologists embedded in a city for decades, and he wanted to know what predicted people's behavior. And the hypothesis originally was the traditional one that if you knew about the person, you would know how they would behave, a sort of personality-driven theory. And what he came to conclude at the end was that, in fact, a lot more of the variance of behavior is predicted by the larger situation that a person finds themselves in than by any variables about the individual that you could happen to find. So for Holt, what you're responding to could, exactly like you said, be very small at one moment or very huge at a later moment. And the goal of psychology is to figure out what that thing you're responding to is.
And
was that half satisfactory?
Yeah. So, so to a large extent, I suspect I mean, as I already suspected, I think I largely agree with Holt. But I'm curious as to whether or not Holt is then really consistent and reconcilable with Gibson. Or more, not just with Gibson, in fact, but more the ecological psychology tradition that has followed Gibson's work since his death. So, as you say, it's sort of a smaller, tractable position, but as is the nature of ecological psychology versus, for example, the caricature of behavioristic psychology or the worst cases of the worst excesses of cognitive psychology that we see, is that what looks like a reasonable reduction of a situation in order to make it tractable, in fact, destroys many of the relations that matter. And is that going to be the same case in the Gibsonians versus whatever Holtian tradition might have become?
I think they are very compatible. I mean, certainly people within the ecological tradition have said and developed ideas, some ideas past where Holt was in his time. I don't think those developments are incompatible. I think they're mostly just things Holt didn't do. And I think that, I mean, I think it's a small part of the bigger picture, and I think that a number of these other traditions that I talked about can be viewed as taking other slices of what can be found within that larger program of research. So I don't think there's anything in Gibson that's explicitly incompatible with Holt's agenda. Obvious disagreements about nuances of minor points, I could laundry list a lot of them. But I think in overall goals, they're compatible.
Okay. Well, then, if I might have one other question, I don't know if I'll have one question, and then if Fred wants to pop in with another, we'll give him one more chance before we finish. And that is, you use the phrase "out there in the world" quite a bit.
Yes.
And so so there's a lot of questions that could follow that statement. But I'm going to go with sort of one of the simpler ones, I suppose, and that is that out there in the world draws a distinction between the agent and the world. And so partly it might simply be a rhetorical issue, but within Holt's work particularly, given that notion of a systemic whole that really is to drive his work, how does an asymmetry that we see in agency, for example, or just the first-person perspective versus some kind of universal perspective in a system, how does that emerge? Or how did Holt talk about that emerging, and how does it emerge in his view? And that would allow you to make that statement out there in the world and say what it means.
I'm not sure that I can satisfactorily answer your more narrow question, but let me try to get at what I see as the broader question. And that is that most traditional approaches to psychology put psychological processes internal to the self, to the soul. And that in dualism you have this separation of the stuff out there in the world, the stuff inside in the mind. I shouldn't even point at the head because the mind is floaty out there somewhere. And that when you get into philosophical idealism, which is where dualism inevitably will take you, you end up with the idea that everything is inside, that everything you experience is made up of mind stuff, soul stuff, whatever you want to call it, and that everything that you can know or respond to or do is internal to the mind, soul, self, whatever. One way to explain what James is doing and what Holt is doing is a radical externalization instead of the radical internalization. They're pushing everything out into the world. So there really is no inside. Nick Thompson, one way he likes to explain this is by saying that the self is an extensionless point. It's just a point of view upon the world. And that everything we want to talk about is real, it's physical, it's material, in a very higher order complex systems way of thinking about that. But there's nothing that can't be captured by a systems level, appropriate level analysis of the world. So it's out there in that sense. And in this way of thinking, self-perception becomes fundamentally akin to other perception. So sometimes when I find myself in a nice liberal arts college giving a talk about these things, I remind them that Know Thyself was written over the great school back in Greece. Mm-hmm. And that part of the reason that was there was the postulate that knowing yourself was in fact a very difficult thing to do. And one of the odd things about, say, a Descartesian tradition is that they assert that the only thing you can really know is yourself, and that it's in fact very easy to do and very natural, and it's knowing things out there that's hard. In this way of thinking, you come to know yourself by observing yourself in the same way that you observe others. You come to know yourself in the same way you come to know others. I ask students to tell me what they think they would do if somebody walked into the classroom right now and emptied a shotgun into the ceiling. And I give them a little while to talk about it, and I say, okay, now, do all of you realize that what you're doing now is just speculating, and that you actually won't know what you would do unless it happens, right? You don't have to go back in time that far to find stories of rich children going off to war to find out if they are brave or not. Because all the sitting there reflectively thinking that you're brave is fine and good, but until the shots fire and you see what you yourself do, you don't actually know if you're brave or not. So even the stuff that we would normally think of as internal in a dualistic system, in this system is something out there to be observed through the same methods that you would observe anything else. And of course, one might claim that we know ourselves better than other people know us, but that's because we're around ourselves more than other people are around us. We've observed ourselves in a wider range of situations. And you could easily imagine yourself beating somebody who, was so unreflexive that they didn't know themselves very well at all, and that you could be with them for only a short amount of time before you knew them better than they knew themselves.
Yeah. So I guess I grasp that, and I think. But I'm curious as to whether Holt had a description of how that perspective emerged. Then, why is there a locus of experience ostensibly associated with this body, for example? Is there
because our body is somewhere.
Okay.
I mean, there's no mystery about why I see the things I do and hear the things I do if it's a body seeing and hearing things, right?
But that's the right. So, but the issue is there. You have to be talking about a body seeing and hearing things. But if we're taking a more systemic view, the seeing and the hearing is never just an individual responding to a stimulus, for example, but rather a perception emerging within a whole situation, right? If we take, again, I'm getting at Holt through Heft here. And it is that, does Holt address that emergence of that asymmetry? I mean, I don't think it's a particularly mysterious or magical notion. I think there's probably a straightforward response to it. I'm just curious as to what Holt himself actually said about the matter. Sorry, Eric, you're muted there at the moment. So.
my intuition is that we'd have to go back on this several more times before a specific section of Holt would jump out that would address what I think you're asking about.
Okay.
So certainly in both Gibson and Holt, there's the notion of this circular interaction with the world. So in any given instance, you can come up with a scenario where something happens and you respond, but what really is happening is a continuous interaction. And I think what I would point out would be that often we need to create the situations that give us that we create the world that we are responding to, and that often we can't be responding to the thing we want to respond to until that interaction has occurred. A simple Gibsonian version of this, which is a really nice illustration in, I'm pretty sure, his last book that people don't talk about much, is looking at the softness or hardness of a surface. And he has a drawing where he shows an object laying in different surfaces, and the surface bends down in or it doesn't, or things like that. So this is back to that sort of more narrow Gibsonian framework. But even in that context, if there isn't that object laying on there, if nothing's pressed against it, if something hasn't fallen and hidden it, or whatever scenario you need, the information is not there yet to determine the hardness or softness of the surface. But through the interaction, we can create that information. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, if we were getting into social psychology, for example, if somebody asked you, am I good at math? Right? There's no way to just sit there and stare at them and suddenly know if they're good at math, right? What you have to do is create a series of interactions that reveal out there in the world the thing that you're looking for.
Okay.
That actually felt pretty good at the end. Was that okay?
Well, no, I'm getting a strong. But what I find interesting there is, insofar as there is an interest in understanding, in taking that perspective and understanding how a first-person perspective emerges, it actually will be. It suggests that there might be substantial, for example, cultural dependency on what a first-person perspective consists in. Insofar that as your culture will provide, that this, so somewhat related to Reid's promoted action, that is, what it is to, we might easily agree that the sense of self is largely dependent on cultural practices, but in fact that logic goes all the way down to the very notion of my perspective on my immediate environment when we talk about precisely what we talk about when we talk about the first-person perspective.
So you mentioned Ed Reid. Ed Reid picked up on a lot of the connection with William James to James Gibson, and had some, but not a super deep understanding of Holt's role as an intermediary there. But certainly he understands a lot of the connections in that larger trajectory you're talking about. So one would certainly expect a lot of these things to be dependent upon culture, in the sense, at a minimum, that one develops within a cultural context that teaches one to be attuned to certain things and not other things, that teaches one to use certain verbal labels for some things and not other things. One could easily imagine cultures, for example, in which different hand gestures mean very different things. So something like this, if I do it to my kids, means hurry the hell up. There are other Hispanic cultures in which this means we'll talk about it later, or let's postpone this thing that you're trying to do now. And so the question is, I think, what effect we think culture has, and I would assert that that culture is part of the larger context in which we develop our attunement to the world. One of the things that, actually this is getting back to what you said, and I think also connected to Fred's first question that I never quite backtracked to, is that this way of thinking, Dr. Thompson, Nick, writes about this a lot, and not that many other people do, is that this is largely a descriptive assertion, not an explanatory assertion. So when the parent asks the question, how is it that my kid is so good at telling me what happened earlier in the day? I assert that what the parent is asking you to explain is how the words coming out of her kid's mouth match a thing that happened earlier in the day, right? That is the description. That is the thing to be explained. Now, it might be the case that a satisfactory explanation for that requires some sort of postulate of internal representations, might require some sort of postulation of a Chomsky-esque world of language. I don't think it does, but it's very possible that it does. But either way, you have to be very careful not to let those hypothetical explanatory constructs be mistaken for the thing you're trying to describe. So what the parent wants explained is how the words match the events of the past. That's the thing being explained. That's the good at remembering that the parent wants an explanation for. And what we, at all cost, have to avoid is suddenly thinking that the parent has asked us to explain an internal movie being watched in the Cartesian soul of the child, right? At best, at absolute best, that's part of a larger explanation. But the thing to be explained is that matching of behavior to circumstances.
Okay. Thanks. So, Fred, do you want to have do you have any last words, or?
I feel we're probably way over time.
Well,
actually,
brief at this point. So.
Yeah, I think we're probably way over time, so I'll leave it there. My question would have gone down the road of is this compatible with eliminativism, basically, because the emphasis on the physical and the real, and I feel that there's the real distinction between enactivism and ecological psychology. But maybe I'll just leave that there and we'll pick it up at a later date. Or unless you would something quick.
So to the extent that might be a distinction between ecological psychology and enactivism, I would say, and probably many people would disagree with me, I would say that it's a product of the narrowness of ecological psychology, not because there's actually a disagreement. So I think that I don't think there's anything that I've seen an enactivist say. Some things I would phrase a little differently. But when you get down to the ideas, I haven't personally seen any assertions by an enactivist that would lead an ecological psychologist to say, no, that's wrong, fisticuffs. I've seen a lot of things where an ecological psychologist of a particular ilk might say, that's fascinating, it doesn't happen to be what our system is designed around to study. And
so are you an eliminativist? And is this behaviorism compatible with eliminativism? Would Church then get on board with this?
I am not sure how to answer that more specific question. I would not characterize any of this stuff as eliminativist in the sense that it's not denying the existence of the thing in question, right? Unlike, if you take a traditional eliminativist like some of Watson's later writing, if you said, I'm interested in what a person believes, Watson would say, or the caricature of Watson would say, believe. Ha! You're interested in something that doesn't exist. Ha 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 ha! Have fun in your little, in your search for ethereal mist. And this is part of the getting back to the American philosophy tradition here. There's no sense in which it's denied that beliefs are things that exist. What's claimed is that beliefs are things that exist out there in the world that can be observed and studied, just like other things that we observe and study. And so this is part of what makes Holt interesting, whether he succeeds or not, is that he's trying to create a behaviorism that can handle and capture the full depth of William James. Right? That's the goal. That's not just his goal. That's what he thinks was William James's goal in James's last works before he died. Whether he's right in that assertion or not, he knew James really well. They talked all the time. James had encouraged him tremendously. So the goal is to create an inclusive system, not an eliminative system in any sort of traditional sense.
Okay, it's a nice, strong conclusion to finish up with. So I know we've got people.
And the book was plugged earlier. This is the special edition of Review of General Psychology that has contributions by our generous host, as well as many other people who were mentioned throughout the talk here.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Eric. And so next month we are jumping continent yet again, this time to Sweden in Europe, because I think Joel Parthamore, a colleague of mine from the University of Sussex, will be giving the next seminar at the beginning of April. So thanks very much, and we will speak to you all in a month.
Looking forward to it.